Hey mammals! Today we're going to be covering the first and only home declared legally haunted. It's going to be a fun one. The home we're going to be discussing is located in Nyack, New York. It is a Victorian-styled home built in 1890. It has 5 bedrooms and 4.5 baths, situated on a dead end right along the Hudson River. Perfect home to move your family into. Speaking of families, in comes the Ackley family, who bought the house around 1967. The family members are George, husband and father, Helen, mother and wife, and their 4 children, William, Carly, Cynthia, and George, who I'll refer to as George Jr., so we don't get confused. Before the Ackleys moved in, I don't know who lived there. I imagine the person who originally had the house built was living there, but I couldn't find any information on prior residents. What I could find was that the house was vacant for about 10 years before the Ackleys moved in. And if you could imagine, a house that's been left sitting around for 10 years needs a lot of work. The Ackleys were also moving from Maryland, so they didn't just do the big move all at once. They were kind of doing it in increments. Helen and George had a tendency of going to the Nyack house from their Maryland farm and just going back and forth, getting stuff done, getting the house ready for everybody to move in, doing all kinds of housework, that kind of thing. Before the Ackleys had bought the house, there had been rumors going around Nyack that the home was haunted, and Helen has even mentioned that when she had bought the house, shortly after buying the house, she was approached by local children who told her, "Hey, did you know the house was haunted? You bought a haunted house. Have fun." And speaking of hauntings, let's actually get into the spooky stuff that went on in the house. Before the family had fully moved in, a plumber was working in the basement, fixing some pipes, checking some pipes, and he kept hearing what he sounded like footsteps in the rooms above him. But every time he would go upstairs, no one would be there. At the time he was doing his work, nobody was in the home. Helen had arrived, and she was planning to stay in the home and work on some stuff, while the rest of her family was still in Maryland, packing their stuff, getting ready to move. And when the plumber was leaving, he told Helen that probably isn't a good idea to stay in the home by yourself. But Helen didn't really pay that any mind. The family started noticing little things at first. They had these casement windows that would just randomly fly open. And we're talking about the kind of windows that you would push open, not the kinds you'd lift up. Often the family would find these windows just open, or they would see them open up on their own, and they would just kind of shut them, think nothing of it. Though I did read that George, the husband, at one point got fed up with one of the windows to the point where, until proper repairs could be made, he just nailed the window shut to prevent it from opening. The family also had a set of French doors in the home that would just fly open on their own, or would just be found ajar, even though people had closed it prior, and the family would just close it any time they found it open and didn't really think too much of it. Alright, let's get into something a little more spooky. Helen found herself home alone one winter night. She was looking out over the Hudson, enjoying the view, when she could have sworn she felt a presence to her left. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and she started getting goosebumps. Something felt weird. She looked to her left, but she couldn't see anybody there. She felt a little freaked out, as anybody would, but she kept her composure, and she decided to loudly say, "Hey, it's a really beautiful view out over the Hudson." And this made her feel a little bit better. After a few minutes of enjoying the view, she decided it's time to go to bed. But as she walked across the room, she could have sworn the presence she was feeling was following her across the room. She then decided to out loud say, "I'm going to bed. Thank you for spending this time with me." And she went upstairs and somehow was able to peacefully sleep the whole night. Personally, I would have been freaked out, and I wouldn't have been trying to speak to anybody. I would have just been looking over my shoulder the entire walk to my bedroom, and probably not slept a peep that whole night. This wasn't the only spooky experience that Helen had. In another instance, she was painting the living room when she felt like somebody was watching her, which according to her, by this point, was kind of a normal experience to have. Still made her feel a little on edge, but wasn't bothering her too much. So she decided to loudly say, "I hope you like the color I picked out." And after she said this, she looked towards the fireplace, and that's when she saw a ghost just floating right there in front of her. The ghost appeared to be an older gentleman wearing a light blue coat. It looked like an older coat, maybe something from, say, the 1700s. And this older ghost gentleman just smiled at her and nodded and slowly disappeared. And Helen took this as the ghost basically saying, yeah, I like the color you picked out. I think by this point, I'd breathe a little easier. You hear a lot of ghost stories where a family moves into a house, starts renovating, the ghosts get pissed and start attacking people, throwing stuff. So I'd sit there and consider it a win. You like the color? Great. Helen wasn't the only one to have ghostly experiences, of course. Her husband, George, also had his own experiences, one of which he was in the basement and he heard footsteps above him. As he was coming up the basement stairs, he saw a pair of ghostly moccasins walking down the hall. Moccasins were not attached to anybody. Kind of freaky. And also there were several instances described where he would have his sandwiches go missing. Nobody in the house claimed to have taken them, so it was kind of assumed the ghosts were just stealing his food. I think that's a line I would draw in the sand. You can scare me, you can talk to me, you can hang out with me, but don't steal my food. Then we have the Ackley's daughter, Cynthia, who had her own experiences. Namely, early in the mornings, if she didn't get up, her bed would start shaking. And the longer she stayed in bed, the more violent the shaking got. Sounds like a great way not to miss school in the morning. When Cynthia was going on her Christmas vacation and wanted to sleep in, like her mother, she loudly announced to the ghosts, "Hey, I want to sleep in. Don't wake me, don't bother me." And for the duration of her vacation time, the ghosts didn't bother her. Her bed never shook. These are turning out to be some really friendly ghosts the more I get through this. The Ackleys' two sons, George Jr. and William, also experienced bed shaking, and their other daughter, Cara Lee, often felt there was a presence in the living room sitting on the couch when nobody was present in the living room. The Ackleys were not the only ones experiencing paranormal phenomena. They often had guests over the many years that they lived in the home. Guests would often find windows open that they had closed, or they would just see windows fly open, doors open, or they would hear voices or footsteps in adjacent rooms, and when they would go and check to see who was there, nobody would be present in those rooms. There's one instance, actually, that I find kind of funny, where Helen was entertaining some guests in the living room when a window suddenly flew open. Kind of spooked everyone. So when Helen went to go close the window, she muttered, "Hey, can you stop messing around? You're scaring the guests." And no more windows flew open for the duration that those people were over. It's as if the ghosts were listening. And, well, I guess they enjoyed having a little fun, but they were respectful when they were told to calm down. And then something a little unrelated to the hauntings, but a guest did die in the home, suffering a brain aneurysm. Some consider this a coincidence, and others think it might be related to the haunting, just because this person was apparently a young adult that was generally healthy. But these things happen, and the ghosts overall have come off as just kind of friendly and like to have fun. I doubt they would be killing anybody. In 1975, Helen's cousin Alfred and his wife Ingrid were visiting and staying over. One of the mornings, Helen noticed Ingrid seemed a little shook up. So she asked Ingrid what was wrong, and Ingrid described how she woke up very early in the morning, when the sun was still down, and how she saw a black spectral figure walking across the bedroom. This figure then sat down on the bed, and to Ingrid's shock, the bed compressed down as if somebody was actually sitting there. This ghost then apparently pulled out a glowing book and started flipping through the pages. Ingrid described this specter as looking like somebody out of the 1700s. When the ghost was, I guess, done looking through the book, he just vanished. Cynthia, the Ackley's daughter, occasionally would see a female apparition in her bedroom. And later on in life, when she was married to her second husband, a man named Mark Kavanaugh, she would be in her bedroom with him. She would be fast asleep. Mark would be getting himself ready to go to bed. Mark was laying on his side with his back towards the edge of the bed when he suddenly felt a presence. He kind of froze in place and just laid there, and he felt this presence looming over him and then leaning against the bed, and he felt the bed pushing down where this presence was leaning against him. He would look over his shoulder and see the apparition of a woman. He just laid there, still, didn't move, didn't make a sound until the apparition disappeared. And for him, this was a pretty scary experience. And out of all the experiences that I've mentioned thus far, this was probably the one that freaked somebody out the most. Oh, and the ghost apparently liked to leave gifts out for people. Specifically, when Cynthia got married to Mark, she found these small silver tongs that nobody in the house knew where they came from, didn't belong to anybody, and were just kind of there. And then when Cynthia had her first child, they found a small gold ring that was kind of described as something a baby would wear. That, again, nobody bought it, nobody knew where it came from, it was just there. Helen did write about the paranormal experiences going on in her home 3 separate occasions, twice for newspapers and once for Reader's Digest in May of 1977. And I actually have a link for that article in the description if you're curious and want to read it. On top of writing about her paranormal experiences, Helen also had her house part of a 5-home tour in Nyack for tourists, specifically her home being the spooky haunted one. Over the many years that the Ackleys lived in the house, they would come to know 3 ghosts, an older couple from the 1700s and a Revolutionary Navy lieutenant. Overall, in general, the family had a pleasant experience living in the house with these ghosts. The ghosts were never coming off as being malicious or having any ill intent. It was kind of more, we'll have some fun, we'll steal your sandwiches, we'll try to startle you kind of thing. The family lived in the home for some 25 years, up until about 1990 when Helen decided it was time to move out, and she put the house for sale. Now, she did this because, well, she was a widow by this point, the taxes had dramatically gone up, she was on a fixed income, so she couldn't exactly continue to afford living there, and she wanted to go somewhere warmer like Florida. Oh yeah, her husband George had passed away in 1978 after a heart surgery that didn't go well. He died in a local hospital, not in the home. I don't know if that's relevant. Anyway, we'll get into the home sale and the eventual court case that resulted from complications, let's say, after I go over some other things. We're going to fast forward a little bit to about 1993. In 1993, Helen was contacted by a paranormal researcher named Bill Merrill and medium Glenn Johnson. They were 2 paranormal researchers out of Oregon who had heard about the haunted house in Nyack and managed to track down Helen, and they wanted to speak to her about the haunting. Helen took the trip out to Oregon to meet with Bill and Glenn, where Glenn had attempted to contact the ghosts that Helen lived with in the home in Nyack. He managed to contact 2 of the 3 ghosts, specifically the couple. Through contacting these ghosts, Glenn was able to figure out that the ghosts' names were George. I know, another one. We're going to refer to this one as Ghost George, just so nobody gets confused. And the other ghost being Margaret. Glenn described the ghosts as being British, living in the Nyack area in the 1700s, and then he went on to describe their appearances to Helen. Helen confirmed that the ghosts he was speaking to were ones that she knew and met when she was living in the Nyack house. Through several sessions, Glenn spoke to Ghost George and Margaret, and he learned that they can come from heaven and visit our plane of existence whenever they wanted. They also learned that Margaret and George weren't married, but rather Margaret was George's housekeeper. And apparently after they had both died, Margaret decided to stay with George as a ghost, not because George was such a great employer, but more so because apparently Margaret was George's mother in a past life. Glenn had also asked these ghosts about their life in the 1700s around the Hudson Valley, Nyack area, and the ghosts gave several details that later Bill asked some historians from the Nyack area, and they were able to confirm majority of the details. That's actually pretty impressive. Oh, and I almost forgot, Bill and Glenn also wrote a book about the Nyack house called Sir George, the Ghost of Nyack. It delved more into Glenn's communications with Ghost George and Margaret and all the information they learned from them. I would have really loved to have included it in this video, but unfortunately it looks like they don't make the book anymore, and I was unable to buy from any vendors that I looked through. Ghost George and Margaret also mentioned how they didn't like the current owners of the Nyack house and they were thinking about just never returning to our plane of existence ever again. Damn, I guess those people are that bad. Probably picked a terrible color for the living room, if I'm being honest. Okay, now that we've gone through all the history stuff and information about the ghosts and the haunting, we're going to backpedal a little bit to the time the home was sold and when the court case happened. Ellen put her house up for sale in 1990 with the help of a real estate agent, Richard, from Ellis Realty. The house was selling for just under $650,000, which by today's money is around $1.6 million. Then we have the potential buyers of the home, Jeffrey and Patricia Stambowski. Now, if you were selling a home that you knew was haunted, would you disclose that? Personally, I feel like I would be morally obligated to tell somebody, hey, the house is haunted, I hope that's not a problem. When it comes to the sale of this home, it depends on who you ask whether or not the home's hauntedness was disclosed. If you ask Helen and her party, they did disclose the haunting, and Jeffrey kind of dismissed it. According to the real estate agent Richard, Helen told him that she refuses to sell the home to Jeffrey until she tells him that the house is haunted, so he knows. And when Helen told Jeffrey about this, Jeffrey kind of laughed it off, made a joke about calling the Ghostbusters. Didn't really think too much of it. He signed the contract to buy the home. He put down a down payment of $32,500, and they were moving forward with closing. According to Richard, Cynthia, and Helen, it wasn't until later when Jeffrey pulled Helen aside and was like, so, how extensive is the haunting? And Helen told him all the different experiences, and that's when Jeffrey was like, oh, hell no, I don't want this house. And he wanted to pull out of the deal. If you ask Jeffrey, on the other hand, him and his wife found out about the haunting after they agreed to buy the house and put down the down payment from a local contractor who was with them at the home and was like, hey, did you know this house is haunted? To where they were both like, huh? So you see, Jeffrey wasn't afraid of ghosts, didn't believe in ghosts. He wasn't concerned about the haunting in that regard. He was more concerned that the haunting would negatively affect the value of the house after he moved in. Who's going to want to buy a house after he buys it that knows the house is haunted? And then his wife, Patricia, who was pregnant at the time, she didn't really feel comfortable being in a house that was potentially haunted or raising any children in a house that was potentially haunted. Regardless of who's telling the truth, at the end of the day, Jeffrey wanted out of the deal and he wanted his money back. But unfortunately, if you sign a contract to buy a home, you need a legitimate reason to get out of it. Hence the whole court case that we're going to get into. The Stambowskis wanted out of the contract, and they also wanted their down payment back. So they filed a legal action in the local courts. They claimed that the house's condition was misrepresented in a fraudulent way. Jeffrey felt that the value of the home would decrease due to the ghost stories tied to it, and of course Patricia was not happy about moving into a house that was potentially haunted. Helen and her agent, Richard, argued that they did not have to disclose the haunting according to New York State's caveat emptor, which is Latin for buyer beware. Basically, this means that it's the buyer's responsibility to figure out everything about the house through asking questions, doing inspections, getting an appraisal, all that kind of stuff. And the judge of the local court ended up siding with Helen and Richard, and he dismissed the Stambowskis' case, meaning that they're not getting their deposit back, and legally they have to buy this house. The Stambowskis were not happy about this decision, so they appealed it in the New York State Supreme Court systems. And in 1991, their case, Stambowski versus Ackley, was seen by the 5 New York State Supreme Court justices. In a 3-2 ruling, the judges ended up siding with the Stambowskis. They ended up overturning the previous dismissal, meaning that the Stambowskis got out of their contract and they were going to get their down payment back. Now, their reasoning for this was that the problem with the house, the haunting and the ghosts, was not a physical one, which means buyers beware can't apply to it. They saw the haunting as more of a reputation about the house, which is not something you can figure out through doing an inspection. So the courts came to the famous ruling that the house was legally haunted. And Helen couldn't deny the hauntings because she, through multiple news articles and even a Reader's Digest article, talked about the haunting. And she also had her house part of a tour for the town, with her house being the haunted house of the tour. And of course, she had a tendency of telling people that her house was haunted and talking about her experiences often. So hard to deny all of that. This ruling would become known as the Ghostbusters Ruling and would often be taught in law schools. I would know that because I never became a lawyer. Interestingly, in 2002, New York State lawmakers passed the Property Condition Disclosure Act, called the Haunted House Statute. And it basically meant that you didn't have to disclose the reputation of the house, whether that involves past murders in the home or any kind of criminal activity, really, or hauntings. And since the Stambosky versus Ackley case, several states have passed their own laws saying you either have to disclose reputational stuff or you don't have to. After the court case and the Stamboskys managed to get out of buying the house, somebody else did end up buying the house. A man named Adam Brooks, who was a filmmaker and a writer, ended up getting the home and living in the home around the 1990s. After him, singer-songwriter Ingrid Michaelson then bought the home and lived in the home up until 2015. Then, after her, we had Matthew Paul Miller move into the home. He is a singer, rapper, and actor with the stage name Matisyahu. Aside from his music career, which I'm not familiar with, he was in a movie I saw, horror movie, called The Possession. It had Jeffrey Dean Morgan in it. It was the one movie where the little girl got a Dybbuk box that had a demon in it that ended up possessing her. And Matthew's character, I forget the name of the character, but he was the Jewish guy who helped the family exorcise this demon from the little girl. He lived in the home till about 2019. And that's about as much information as I was able to find about residents after the Ackleys moved out. I did read that the home was sold again in 2021. However, I couldn't find any information on who got it this time. And you may be wondering, with all these people going through the house, what were their experiences like inside the home? Well, with 3 owners in about 30 years, certainly somebody should have mentioned something about ghosts, right? Well, none of the previous owners post-court case mentioned anything about ghosts. So was the house really even haunted? Let's start with the house itself. Now, to me, it's no surprise that it was rumored to be haunted before the Ackleys moved in. The house was about 70 years old by the time it started going vacant, and it remained vacant for 10 years. A house that's vacant for 10 years tends to kind of start rotting and falling apart. Which, a creepy house on a dead end, nice and big, looking a little ominous maybe, local kids making up stories about it being haunted, that's spreading to parents and that's spreading around the town, kind of makes sense to happen. Speaking of the house's poor state, let's talk about some of the activity, like the footsteps, for example. Ever been in an old house? They tend to creak and squeak. With this house again being vacant for 10 years, it was no surprise that this happened. If you're walking through an old house, you could compress some of the floorboards, for example, and then later those floorboards could pop back up, creating creaking and maybe in a rhythmic way to sound like footsteps. Also, temperature tends to fluctuate, and in those kinds of older houses, insulation wasn't 100%, so a lot of the materials of the house, like say wooden floors, would contract and expand with temperature changes. This creates creaking and squeaking, which can again make it sound like somebody's moving around. Helen herself, fun fact, in the Reader's Digest article mentioned that old houses creak. So maybe kind of her hinting that some of the activity wasn't really ghosts. Then you had the windows that would swing open and those French doors that would open on their own. Again, the house was old. Parts of the house were in disrepair. I'm sure the any bolts or locks or anything keeping the doors closed or the windows closed were probably pretty shot, and wind could probably pretty easily open the windows and the doors. And Helen herself, again, even mentions that after a lot of the repairs were done, the windows and doors would stop flying open on their own. And she even said that she felt bad for the ghosts and would often leave, say, the windows unlocked or unhinged just so they could be blown open by the ghosts whenever they wanted. Personally, I don't think it was the ghosts blowing the windows open. I think it was the wind. Then you have stuff like people hearing voices. This can again be explained with the house being older. Certain sounds around the home could potentially sound like people speaking, or maybe people speaking in other rooms, depending on how the acoustics are and how the sound flies. Maybe you think you're hearing it in one room when nobody's actually in that room. And it's also entirely possible that people outside the home speaking could sound like sounds coming on inside the home. It was an old house. It wasn't insulated like they make houses today. The glass in the windows was probably thinner, which allows for more noise to get in. Stuff like that can be explained. Not entirely, I'll be honest, but it can be explained. And then there's the witnesses to the paranormal stuff, aside from Helen and her family members. Helen would often mention how she would have guests over and they would see windows fly open or they would hear footsteps in the other room. But again, as I mentioned before, that stuff can be explained. And even people like Alfred and Ingrid, who had their experiences, I couldn't find any interviews or them directly talking about their stuff. All the things I could find about witnesses having their own paranormal experiences, all of it came from Helen. I'm not saying she made it up, but I'm saying it's entirely possible she may have made some of the stuff up. The only people that I could find actually discussing their personal experiences was Helen, her daughter Cynthia, and Cynthia's husband, Mark. Some of the stuff for Mark I found was written by Helen, so I don't know how to fully take that. But those were really the only three people that mentioned specifically having haunted stuff happen to them and actually talk about it themselves. What about those gifts that were left for Cynthia when she got married and for her baby when she had her first child? Well, coincidentally, those gifts disappeared shortly after they appeared. I guess the ghosts giveth and the ghosts taketh away. Then we have Bill and Glenn, the paranormal researcher and the medium, respectively. If you recall, Bill and Glenn reached out to Helen after they heard about her haunted house. Granted, this was after she moved out of the house and was living in Florida. Anyway, Glenn claimed to have contacted two of the ghosts, and he was able to describe them to Helen, to which Helen said that that's exactly what she saw when she had her ghostly experiences. And then Glenn went on to get historical information from these ghosts that was able to be largely confirmed by historians from the Nyack area. This all sounds very impressive and has to prove that the ghosts are real. Well, it is until you realize that Bill and Glenn had access to Helen's previous writings and the descriptions she wrote about the ghosts. It'd be really easy for them to say, or rather for Glenn to say, that he sees these two ghosts and then describe them to Helen just based off of her writings. Of course, she's going to agree with that. She's the one who wrote the stuff. She's the one who says that she saw the ghosts, so she's going to know what they look like. And then there was the historical information that the ghosts told Glenn that was able to be confirmed by historians. Well, it turns out that a lot of that information that was given was really basic information about the Nyack area and could really be researched and found out by just about anybody looking into the area. Historians couldn't confirm everything that Glenn was saying that the ghosts were saying, and something that the historians couldn't confirm was the identities of the ghosts themselves. Ghost George and Margaret could have been British people that came over from England to the colonies around that time, living in that area. I'm sure there were definitely a lot of Georges, probably a lot of Margarets. But the people specifically described, historians couldn't really find that they really lived in the area. Oh, and then there's the book. Look at the cover again. Look really closely. Specifically at the deck area. You see anything? Because I sure don't. You see, according to Glenn, if you have what he calls paranormal vision, you could see two ghosts on the deck on the cover. He took a picture of the front of the house for the cover of the book, and he happened to capture the two ghosts, Ghost George and Margaret, according to him at least. Glenn claimed to have shown the photo to 6 other psychic type people, and they were able to see the ghosts as well. However, you can see how it's kind of hard for me to believe that. Why even tell me there's ghosts on the cover if I'm not even going to be the one to see it? You know, it's funny. The home has a tendency of attracting creative people. A filmmaker, a singer-songwriter, the rapper, actor. Even Helen herself was a creative person. She was a creative writer. Now, in my opinion, I think it's entirely possible, being inspired by the rumors of the home being haunted and also seeing windows fly open and hearing creaks, stuff that would happen in an old rotting house, she used all those experiences and rumors to get her creative juices flowing, and she made up the hauntings. But with all the other stuff I've discussed and all the stuff that I've read about and presented to you, in my opinion, it definitely seems like the house wasn't really haunted. I know I mentioned that in one of Glenn's channeling of the ghosts and speaking to them, Ghost George and Margaret said that they don't plan on coming back because they didn't like the current owner of the home, this being that filmmaker at the time. This was 1993, a couple years after Helen moved out, and yet the filmmaker never reported having any kind of ghostly stuff happen. I guess maybe the ghosts just didn't like him and didn't want to show themselves, and eventually they just decided, screw it, we're not coming back. I'm not sure. But you might be wondering, if Helen made up the ghost stories, then why even entertain Bill and Glenn when they contacted her? I think it's entirely possible, and again, this is just my opinion, that she missed the attention of being the person who owned the haunted house. And while she had largely moved on from all that and was enjoying her life in Florida, when Bill and Glenn contacted her, she kind of saw this as an opportunity. I mean, she flew out to Oregon to meet these people. I'm sure it was probably pretty interesting if she did fake it, and then you have Bill and Glenn sitting there claiming that they can channel these ghosts, and Helen's just sitting there, oh really? Yeah? They said that? Meanwhile, in the back of her head, she's like, oh wow, these guys are full of shit like me. I don't know. Maybe that's how it went down. Maybe it didn't go down that way. The house could have been haunted for all I know. I wasn't there. It's just, for me, a lot of the evidence really points to more the haunting was probably made up. But a cool court case did come out of it, so that's something. I hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry it took so long to get this out. Been really busy the last couple of weeks, and there was also a lot more information about this than I thought there was actually going to be. If you liked the video enough, maybe give it a like. Subscribe if you want to see more. Next video is going to be aliens. It's going to be another really long and extensive topic, but I'm excited to cover it. Anyway, until next time, if you live in a haunted house, try to make friends with your ghost buddies. Isn't that something that maybe made any of you guys curious? Always read about and hear about ghosts, always messing people up after changing how a house looks. Meanwhile, Helen and her family made changes to the house, and the ghosts are like, oh, you know what? This is actually a lot better. Also, the fact that the ghosts apparently weren't previous residents of the house, they just kind of took up residence after they died. I found that kind of weird too. Anyway, I'm just rambling now. What are you still doing here? Get out of here.